On a quiet Monday morning, my son dropped a manila envelope on my kitchen table and said, "Dad, pack your things. Make room for your grandson's family." My wife, still recovering from spinal surgery, whispered, "This is our home." He ignored her and walked out. I tore open that envelope and found what I never expected: a moving truck reservation room assignments, the whole blueprint for pushing us out of our own house. Welcome back to Alpha Dad Stories. Glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, hit subscribe so the next story comes right to you. While we get started, I'd love to know what you're up to. Are you driving somewhere, putting a meal together, or just resting for a few minutes? Drop it in the comments. Now, a quick note: some details in today's story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. What matters most is the message at the heart of it. A Monday, early September. One of those mornings where summer hasn't quite let go, still warm enough that I'd pushed the kitchen window up a few inches, while the coffee worked its way through the pot. Lorene had settled into the armchair near the back window, glasses perched on her nose, a paperback resting open across her knees. 3 months past the spinal surgery, and she'd finally gotten to where she could sleep a full night. Standing there at the counter listening to the coffee finish, I had the feeling, cautious, tentative, that we were rounding a corner. The worst of it done. I ought to have known not to trust that feeling. In my experience, when things go quiet, and even it usually means something is gathering itself just out of sight. Kevin's car in the driveway didn't put me on alert. He'd made a habit of stopping in ever since Lorene's surgery, sometimes just him and Suzanne, sometimes with Brody and the grandchildren in tow. I'd welcomed it. That's what you want, isn't it? Family drawing closer when things get hard. I topped off my mug and poured a second one, left it at the counter's edge the way I do when I'm expecting someone to walk in. What I hadn't counted on was the doors, one, then another, then a third, a fourth. And before anyone had even knocked, the children's voices were already bright and loud in the front yard. Kevin was first through the door. 48 years old, my son, with wide shoulders and the kind of self-possession that enters a room before the man himself does. Sells cars across town, good at the pitch, good at the grin, good at framing whatever he's about to propose as simple logic. Suzanne came in right behind him, 45, put together in that particular way that always left me feeling like a guest in my own kitchen. Then Brody, our grandson, at 27, his wife Amber beside him, and their 2 boys who hit the kitchen floor at a run and started circling the table like it was a track they'd been training for. "Well," I said, still grinning at that didn't expect a Monday crowd. Kevin's face didn't move. He placed a manila envelope flat on the table, unhurried, deliberate the way a man lays down something he's already decided, then drew out a chair and sat in it. Not the way a visitor sits, the way a man settles in at a desk that belongs to him. "Dad," he said, lacing his fingers together, "we need to talk about the house." Lorene's eyes came up from her page. I saw her hand stop moving. "What about the house?" Kevin said it the way a news anchor reads a forecast. Brody lost his rental. Landlord decided not to renew. He kept going before I could speak. 2 kids, Amber's only working part-time. They need a stable situation. 3 bedrooms here. You and Mom are only using 1. I set my mug down slowly. "Kevin, what is it you're actually saying to me?" He leaned in, forearms flat on my table, and he gave me a smile, a patient, careful smile, the kind a man practices. "Everything's already been taken care of, Dad. There's a unit over on 527 Kendall Avenue. 1 floor less, upkeep, sized right for the 2 of you at this stage. Suzanne and I drove over and had a look." "It's a good fit," Suzanne added, stepping in as if she'd been waiting for that exact moment, her voice carrying that practiced warmth. "We've spoken with the building manager already. All you 2 would need to do is show up." Moving truck packing, we've got it handled. My hands sat still on the counter. My chest did not feel still. At this stage, I said back to him. Kevin's voice went down a notch. Dad, you're 75. Mom's still in recovery. A house this size for 2 people doesn't make sense anymore, and Brody's family needs somewhere they can count on. This is the logical answer. The family answer. Making room, that's what you do for the people you love. Lorene set her book on the side table. A small sound. Then she moved herself forward to the armchair's edge. I could read what it cost her. In the set of her jaw, that tight, controlled effort she'd never call a grimace, and she straightened herself up carefully. Kevin, she said, quiet but without any give in it. This is our home. He looked at her. Something shifted behind his eyes there and gone in a blink, and then his gaze slid sideways past her toward the wall, like her words were an obstacle he could simply go around. Mom, I know this feels like it's coming out of nowhere. It isn't a feeling, she said. It is coming out of nowhere. Brody had stationed himself near the refrigerator, hands buried in his pockets, studying the floor with the focus of a man who wished he were somewhere else entirely. Amber was chasing the boys away from the cabinet doors. She hadn't looked at me directly since they'd come in, not once. Kevin pushed back his chair and stood. He'd reached the end of whatever patience he'd budgeted for this. Dad. Sharper now, the easy manner gone. Don't turn this into a problem. Brody has 2 children. You've had your years here. Now it's time to make room for your grandson's family. That is what a family does. That is what decent people do. The room felt like the air had been pressed out of it. I stood there looking at my son. This man I'd stood behind at Little League, driven to SAT prep, handed money to, when he needed his first car, telling me to walk out of my own house. And something in me, something that had been patient and yielding for 75 years, went absolutely still. Not at peace. Still. Like the stillness in a room just before a storm declares what it came to do. I need you to hear something, Kevin. My voice came out steadier than I felt. This house is not on offer. Not for Brody. Not for you. Not for anyone who wasn't invited through that door. Am I making myself clear? He held my gaze. Just for a beat, something surfaced in his expression. A look I hadn't seen since he was a kid, trying to talk his way out of something he'd done wrong. Then his jaw went tight. We'll revisit this once you've had a chance to sit with it. He scooped his keys off the counter. Brody, we're leaving. Out the door. Suzanne trailed after him, something low-voiced about giving us time. Brody paused in the doorway and looked back at me once his face closed off, though there might have been something apologetic underneath it. Or I may have needed to see it that way. The door shut. Lorene let out a breath she'd been holding. I walked over and took the chair beside her, our arms touching. Her hand came to mine and closed around it with a grip I hadn't expected, stronger than a woman 3 months out of surgery had any reason to have. Her fingers were like ice. Walter, she said quietly. That envelope. He left it on the table. I looked back at it. The manila envelope sat where Kevin had put it, flat and undisturbed, like an invoice he'd already assumed we'd settle. I see it, I told her. He didn't take it. I held her hand a moment longer, then gave it a squeeze and said the only honest thing I had. I know Renee. I know he didn't. Once they were gone, I moved to the armchair by the front window, the one Lorene has called my old man throne for going on 2 decades now, and I didn't move from it for a long time. I just watched the September light travel slowly across the floorboards. Lorene had gone to lie down. Her face, when I'd walked her back to the bedroom, wore that careful blankness I'd come to recognize a woman marshaling everything she had to hold herself together, not willing to put her grief on top of mine. I kissed her forehead, said to rest. Then I came back and lowered myself into that chair with nothing for company but the afternoon light and everything the morning had left behind. There's something I've never said to another living person. The very first time I set foot in this house during the walkthrough, back when it still belonged to someone else, I wept. Not there. I held it in through the showing, kept my face neutral through the documents and the handshake. But sitting afterward in a Perkins parking lot, just me in the car, I broke down completely. Because I was 33 years old, and I'd just put my signature on something that would consume the rest of my working years to pay for. And it was the single most frightening and most correct decision I had ever made in my life. We came to 219 Sycamore Lane in the spring of 1986. Lorene was 5 months pregnant with Kevin. A mattress on the bedroom floor, a folding table in the kitchen, that was the furniture situation, because there was no money for anything else yet. I remember the way she laughed when she realized the folding table had a bent crossbar and wouldn't sit level. Full laughter, nothing held back. "Walter," she said, wedging a stack of old catalogs underneath to prop it up. "I believe this is the beginning of our empire." By that point, I'd already put in 11 years on the night shift at the Caldwell Distribution Warehouse, inventory management, counting, logging, reconciling. No one makes toasts about that kind of work. There are no plaques. But it was reliable, and it was honorable. And each week I set aside part of that check for the mortgage the way you keep a promise. Because that's exactly what it was. 6 years without a vacation. Lorene stitched Kevin's Halloween costumes by hand, rather than buy them ready-made. I ran a truck with a broken heater through 3 Indiana winters and told myself a car payment wasn't something we could carry. Year after year, I took the Christmas shift, let the younger fathers go home to their kids while I clocked in, banked the holiday differential, and entered every dollar into a spreadsheet I treated with the reverence some men give Scripture. Looking back on that now, something tightens in my chest. Not grief. More like tenderness, the feeling of watching a younger version of yourself pour everything into something he couldn't yet name but believed in completely. Then 1994 rolled around, and the Caldwell plant made its first round of cuts. A supervisor who trusted me kept my name off the list. I survived by 3 months. Those 3 months were the nearest we ever got to the bank taking the house out from under us. 2 payments down. Envelopes arriving with the measured, bloodless phrasing of institutions that have practiced delivering bad news without calling it bad news. It was Lorene who kept us from going under. Her Aunt Irene, a reserved woman, no children, the same 4 walls in rural Kentucky. Her entire life had died the year before, leaving a modest inheritance divided among the nieces. Lorene's portion was what it needed to be. No windfall. Just the exact number that mattered. I want to put it toward the house. She said it that evening across the kitchen table, the bank letters lying between us like evidence. Her tone was level, decisive, the voice she uses when the decision is already behind her, and she's simply letting me catch up. "Renee, that's your money. Money from your people. Walter." Her hands came together on the table. "This house is my people's money." There was nothing to argue against, and I had no desire to try. What we couldn't have seen from where we were sitting, what neither of us could have anticipated, was that paying down that mortgage with her inheritance would eventually pull a thread. A conversation with Stuart Quill, our family attorney, about how to protect what we'd built. A document executed in his office on a cold Tuesday afternoon. The kind of choice married people make in private, no ceremony, no announcement, not a word breathed to anyone outside the room who didn't need to know. But that's for later. Right now, I want to describe what I was carrying as I sat in that armchair on a Monday in September, staring out at an empty driveway where my son's car had been. 40 years of night shifts. 6 Christmases at the warehouse while other men sat at their tables. A folding table with a bent crossbar propped up with a stack of old catalogs, and a woman finding that funny laughing like it was the cornerstone of something grand. I levered myself out of the chair and moved through the rooms slowly, the way a man walks when he's reminding himself what a place means. My palm ran along the kitchen doorframe. I'd torn that out and rehung it myself in 2003 after dry rot hollowed the base. I paused at the hallway corner where Kevin had stood every birthday to get his height marked until he turned 17. 2 coats of paint over those pencil lines, and still the faintest impression ghosted through. I stopped in the doorway of Lorene's recovery room 3 weekends I'd given to converting it, peeling back the carpet, mounting grab bars, laying non-slip flooring throughout. The hospital-grade bed sat against the wall. Her walker stood folded beside the nightstand. The reading lamp was positioned just right so she could see without straining her neck. My throat seized up before I had time to brace for it. Not sadness, not quite. Fury dressed in sadness's clothes. Kevin had stood in my kitchen that morning. The kitchen I had earned with my back and my sleep and every trip I didn't take. And he'd told me I was done needing it. He'd looked at his mother's recovery room and calculated square footage for grandchildren to play in. He'd set an envelope on my table and presented it as a kindness. When I came back to the kitchen, the manila envelope was exactly where he'd left it, centered on the table with the deliberateness of something meant to be found. I stood over it a moment without touching it. Through the window, the September light it was draining toward orange, the sky going soft at the edges, and from the back of the house, I could just make out the low murmur of Lorene's television. I sat down, laid both hands flat on either side of the envelope. Kevin had cleared out fast, but he'd left this behind. That's not how you forget something. You don't walk out and leave the whole reason you came. My heart was working harder than made sense for a man doing nothing but sitting. 40 years of knowing when a warehouse count was off before anyone ran the numbers, that same instinct was now telling me the contents of that envelope and the visit that delivered it were 2 very different things. I opened it. There is a variety of cold that the room's temperature has nothing to do with. It moved through me the second I drew out the first page, beginning behind the sternum, spreading outward in a slow, widening ring the way a pond locks over on a still night. Unhurried, quiet, inescapable. The top sheet was a U-Haul reservation confirmation machine printed on company letterhead, booking number included. The rental date, the 2nd Saturday of September. Pick up a U-Haul location off Route 36, and the delivery address the moment my hands started feeling distant, detached like they were someone else's problem, was 219 Sycamore Lane. My address. Filed and confirmed 8 weeks prior. 8 weeks. Lorene was still hospitalized 8 weeks ago. Still working at that point on sitting upright without assistance. And Kevin had already arranged a moving truck to arrive at my door. He never asked. The words came out on their own, aimed at no one, swallowed by the empty kitchen. He never once asked. I turned the page. Beneath it was a handwritten note on pale green notepad paper. Suzanne's hand, unmistakable, those big looping letters I'd seen on birthday cards going back years. This was not a birthday card. It was a room chart. Master bedroom, Brody and Amber. Back, recovery room, kids' playroom. Remove medical equipment first. Walter and Lorene, studio, Kendall Avenue. She'd written, remove medical equipment first, with the same flat practicality as a grocery reminder. A bullet point. As though Lorene's grab bars, her bed, her walker were staging clutter to be hauled away before the rightful occupants settled in. My back teeth pressed together until my jaw ached. I kept reading. Behind that were several pages of printouts, screenshots more precisely from a group text. The thread was titled Moving Day, with a small truck beside it. 9 participants listed. My name appeared nowhere. The oldest message was from 6 weeks back. Suzanne had sent it. Okay, everyone locking in second Saturday of September. Who has a truck or knows someone? We need at least 2 able-bodied helpers for the heavy stuff, Kevin answered. I'll handle the U-Haul. Brody, you and Amber start packing what you want to keep from the rental. And then came the message that pushed the edges of my vision. Soft Brody writing back, Grandpa's place is actually really nice. The backyard is huge. The kids are going to love it. Grandpa's place. Not our home. Not where Grandpa and Grandma live. No hedge, no hesitation, no question mark trailing the thought. None of the ordinary human courtesy of asking whether this was even on the table. Just Grandpa's place delivered as settled fact. As though the deed had already changed hands and nobody had gotten around to telling me. I pressed my palm flat to the table to keep my hand from trembling. The message below that was from someone identified as Rosemary B. Kevin's Aunt Rosemary, his late mother's sister, a woman I had crossed paths with perhaps twice in 10 years. So sweet that the family is coming together like this. Walter and Lorene must be relieved to have help. Relieved. That was the word she used. Because not a single voice in that thread through all those weeks of planning had mentioned that Walter and Lorene hadn't been consulted. That Walter and Lorene hadn't consented. That Walter and Lorene weren't organizing a plan, they were the subject of one. We weren't the family. We were the transaction. I leaned back and let my eyes go to the ceiling. The overhead light gave off its faint electric hum. A car rolled past, outside headlights cutting briefly across the window glass, and then the street went dark again. You didn't make a mistake, I said, and the words scraped out like something dredged from gravel. You made a schedule. I brought my eyes back down to the table, the confirmation sheet. Suzanne's pale green notepad paper, 9 names coordinating a move-in date for a property none of them owned. I turned over the last 2 months in my mind. Kevin and Suzanne showing up regularly, bright and willing. Kevin hauling in grocery bags, Suzanne setting fresh flowers on the kitchen counter. I had read all of that as family closing ranks around a hard stretch, grateful. That's what I'd been. My stomach clenched hard at that. They hadn't been visiting at all. They'd been assessing. Every, how are you holding up, Dad? Every, just let us know what you need. Each one of those visits had been reconnaissance. They'd been pacing my rooms, eyeing the walls, calculating what a fresh coat of paint would run before the next family came through the door. I gathered the pages back into the manila envelope. Set it precisely where Kevin had left it, dead center on the table, squared up. Then I rose slowly, because my knees weren't entirely reliable, and I wasn't about to let an empty kitchen watch me lose my footing. I switched the light off, stood a moment in the dark, and I made myself a promise. The quiet kind, the sort that needs no audience because the man making it is the only one accountable for keeping it. You want to treat this like a business transaction, Kevin? Fine. Then let's conduct it like one. I went upstairs and I did something I hadn't managed in a long while. I slept on my side of the bed in my house, and I slept the way a man sleeps once he knows exactly where the ground is beneath him. Come morning, I had somewhere to be. I pulled out of the driveway at 7:00 a.m., the sky still working out what kind of day it planned to be. Lorene was asleep. I left her a note on the counter, went for a drive back before 10 coffee's ready, and propped it against the ceramic creamer where she'd catch it the moment she walked in. Then I backed out carefully, the way you do when the neighborhood hasn't fully woken yet, and you'd rather not be the one who starts it. 520. Kendall Avenue was 12 minutes from the house. I know because I watched the clock the entire drive, marking every turn, every light, every place the GPS nudged me somewhere I wasn't interested in going. 12 minutes. That was Kevin's idea of close enough for his parents. close enough for a 72-year-old woman who was still teaching herself to cross a room without flinching. The building appeared ahead, and I eased to the curb engine idling and just looked at it for a moment. 4 stories of brick, the kind of structure that was probably considered sound when it went up in the 60s and had been living off that reputation ever since. The exterior paint was making a valiant effort. A row of metal mailboxes flanked the front entry, several of them dented. No ramp from the sidewalk, just 2 worn concrete steps up to a glass lobby door, the edges rubbed smooth by decades of daily use. "All right," I said to no one. "Let's have a look." In the lobby, a man in his 50s was sorting mail behind a low counter. The building manager, as it turned out, heavy-set, a fellow named Mr. Halloran, reading glasses riding up on his forehead, wearing the expression of a man who has fielded every conceivable question about this building at least 4 times and is fully prepared to go another round. "Help you, not unfriendly about it." "My son was in contact with you about a unit," I said. "2nd floor. I'm Walter Corbin. I'd like to take a look." Mr. Halloran found the inquiry on his screen without any trouble. "Corbin, yeah. Unit 214. Son called about 6 weeks back, put a hold on showing it." He came around the counter with a key fob. "The elevator's out this week, so we'll go up the stairs." "How often does that happen?" I asked. He tilted his head, considering. "Few times a year, day or 2 usually." I followed him up. 14 steps I counted, with a single handrail along the right side that shifted a little when I tested it. The 2nd floor hallway was narrow, the carpet a brown that had probably been burgundy in a former life. Unit 214 sat halfway down on the left. Mr. Halloran unlocked it and pushed the door open. "Good bones," he said, "which is what you say about a cramped space when you want the other person to feel better about it." The living room had room for a couch and a television, provided you weren't planning to move around both simultaneously. The kitchen ran galley-style, 1-person wide, with a window above the sink that looked straight into the brick wall next door. I moved through it all at a deliberate pace, inventorying the space the way 4 decades of warehouse work had taught me to, seeing what was actually there, rather than what someone wanted me to imagine it could become. Then I reached the bathroom, pushed the door open, stood in the frame, and understood immediately what had been pricking at the back of my mind all morning. The door opening was 28 inches across. That might not register as significant at first, so let me put it the way it hit me. Lorene's wheelchair, the one she relies on when her legs give out after a long day, measures 25 inches wide. It would pass through that doorway. Barely. 1.5 inches of clearance on either side, give or take. But fitting through the door is only the beginning of the problem. What comes after is what matters. You need floor space to bring the chair alongside the toilet. You need room for a second person, a caregiver, a husband, whoever's lending a hand to stand next to you and help. You need the ability to maneuver, to turn, to manage the ordinary physical business that becomes an ordeal when your body is still mending from surgery, and the space around you wasn't built with that in mind. This bathroom offered none of that. No grab bar beside the toilet, no non-slip surface on the floor, no room for anyone assisting without pressing against the sink. A woman on a walker would have had to leave it in the hallway and hope nothing went wrong. "When did my son first get in touch about this unit?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Mr. Halloran glanced at his phone. 6 weeks ago. Week of July 21st. The same window as the U-Haul reservation. The same window as the group text. Kevin had called this man and put a hold on showing this apartment at the same moment he was assembling a 9-person moving crew, and he had said not a word about any of it to me or to Lorene. "Thank you, Mr. Halloran," I said. "I've seen what I needed to see." He walked me back down the 14 stairs and held the lobby door for me. Out on the sidewalk, the morning had warmed some, and a woman was coming past with a small dog on a leash. Everything looked so ordinary that I could barely square it with the cold, exact fury that had settled into my chest. I sat in my car, both hands on the wheel, studying the building through the windshield. My son had looked at his mother, a woman who had required 3 weekends of renovation work, just to use her own bathroom with any safety, and chosen her a second-floor unit with a 28-inch bathroom door and an elevator that went down several times a year, and called it a solution, called it the right thing for this point in our lives. The worst of it, the part that drove my knuckles pale against the wheel, was that this wasn't a mistake. A mistake happens when you don't think something through. Kevin had thought this through. He'd priced it out, put a hold on it 6 weeks in advance, measured every detail. He had looked at that apartment, that bathroom door included, and chosen it with full knowledge of what he was choosing. Which left only one conclusion. He wasn't trying to look after us. He was trying to relocate us somewhere we wouldn't be in the way. I started the car, turned back onto Kendall Avenue, and for all 12 minutes of the drive home to Sycamore Lane, one question followed me through every stop sign and every red light, and I could not shake it loose. If his plan for us was this careless, what exactly was his plan for the house? I pulled into the driveway and sat before going in. That's when I noticed the front door, or rather something about the key hook, visible through the glass panel beside it. Something was off. I couldn't name it yet, but I was going to work it out before the morning was done. The door had barely shut behind me before I was standing at that hook. I'd had it put in during our first month at Sycamore Lane. A plain wooden rack, 5 pegs, stained dark walnut, hung beside the front window, where the light caught it well. For 38 years, I had known at a glance exactly what belonged on it. My car key, Lorene's spare the back door key, and 2 matching brass copies of the front door lock. One for emergencies, one for the neighbors we trusted. I counted what was there now. 4 keys, not 5. One of the brass front door copies was missing. My chest did something complicated, a slow squeeze like a fist closing around my heart, 1 finger at a time. I counted again. Still 4. I checked my own keyring. Mine was there. I checked the hook by the back door where Lorene sometimes sets things when her hands are full. Nothing. I found her in the recovery room, propped up in the adjustable bed with her physical therapy worksheet across her lap, the daily exercise sheet Dr. Aldridge had put together for her. She looked up when I came through the doorway, and whatever was on my face told her this wasn't a casual visit. "Walter," she said. "What's wrong?" "Renee." I kept my voice soft, the way you do when you're trying not to frighten someone who has already been through more than enough. "Did you give anyone a copy of the front door key lately?" Her hand went still against the worksheet. I watched the memory move across her face, a ripple, then a small, uncertain crease between her brows. "Suzanne asked," she said slowly. "About a month ago, maybe 6 weeks. She said it was in case of an emergency, in case something happened to one of us when you weren't around." Her voice dropped slightly. "Walter, I thought you knew. I assumed she'd already talked to you." I sat down on the edge of the bed and took both her hands in mine. They were ice cold, the way they always go when she's worried and working hard not to show it. I held them between my palms and looked at her. "It's okay," I said. You didn't do anything wrong." "Didn't I?" Her eyes moved across my face, and the look in them, that particular mixture of guilt and slow dawning understanding, pulled my throat tight. "Walter, she asked so nicely. She said you two were getting older and she just wanted to be prepared." "I know, sweetheart." I squeezed her hands. "I know exactly how she asked." I kissed her on the forehead, went to the kitchen, and called Kevin. He picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice carried that particular ease of a man who believes the situation he's managing is firmly in hand. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" "Does Suzanne have a key to this house?" I asked. A pause. Short, barely a full second, but I had spent 40 years reading inventory counts, and I know the gap between a man who's thinking and a man who's deciding what to say. "Mom gave it to her," Kevin said. "For emergencies. You know how it is, Dad. You're not always home. Mom's still in recovery. It makes sense." "When did she have it made?" I asked. "I don't know, a few weeks back." "What's this about?" "What kind of emergency, son?" I said. "Calls for a copy of my front door key that was cut 6 weeks ago, the same week you booked a U-Haul to my address." The silence stretched longer this time, and inside that silence I could hear the machinery shifting, the salesman side of him, rotating, searching for the framing that made this look reasonable. "Dad, you're connecting things that don't belong together. Suzanne got that key because we care about you. That's the whole story." "Kevin." My voice came out quieter than I'd planned, and somehow that made it land harder. "You scheduled a truck to move us out of our own house before you said a single word to either of us. Your wife is holding a key to my front door. I just drove over to look at an apartment with a broken elevator and a bathroom your mother cannot safely use. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think before you answer. What exactly are you planning?" His tone changed. The warmth ran out of it the way water runs out of a tipped glass, and what took its place was something flatter, something that reminded me uncomfortably of a closing argument. "I'm planning for the future, Dad. Someone in this family has to. If you want to hold on to that house indefinitely, that's your right, but reality doesn't wait forever. We're trying to get out ahead of it. You ought to be grateful instead of treating us like we're the problem." "I see," I said. "Good. So let's just, I'll talk to you soon, Kevin." I ended the call before he could finish his sentence. I set the phone down on the counter, pressed both palms flat against the cool laminate, and stood there breathing evenly until the urge to hit something faded. Suzanne hadn't borrowed that key out of love. She hadn't asked for it out of concern. She had obtained it the same week the truck was booked, the same week the group chat went live, the same week they put a hold on Unit 214 at 527 Kendall Avenue. Every piece had been positioned at once, and the key was simply one more piece in the arrangement. This wasn't preparation for a crisis. It was preparation for a takeover. I went to my study and found the magnet I'd stuck to the side of the filing cabinet 2 years ago, a local locksmith Hendrickson, and son the one who had rekeyed the back door when we'd misplaced a key at Christmas. I peeled it off and laid it on the desk. I wasn't ready to use it yet. There were things I still needed to know, things I suspected but couldn't put in front of anyone yet. That evening, I called my neighbor, Gil Metzger. He picked up on the second ring, which was characteristic of Gil. He was the sort of man who answered his phone the way other men reach for a tool. No deliberation. "Ready to help." "Gil," I said, "I need to ask you something about that security camera you mounted on your porch." Gil Metzger has lived across the street from us for 22 years. He's 73, retired from the county roads department, and he tends sweet corn and peppers in raised beds along his south fence that never win anything at the county fair and taste better than anything you'd find at the grocery store. He's not a man of many words, but the ones he uses carry weight. And when I turned up at his door at 7:30 Wednesday morning, he took one look at my face and said, "Come in, coffee's on." That's Gil. No ceremony. No extra steps. He poured 2 mugs without asking how I took mine after 22 years. He already knew, set them on the kitchen table, settled in across from me and waited. "The camera on your porch," I said. "How much of the street does it cover?" Front of my property, both directions along the street, and your driveway back about 15 feet. He wrapped both hands around his mug. Why, I told him. Not everything, not the manila envelope, not Kendall Avenue, not the key. Just enough. I said I had reason to believe someone had entered my home without my knowledge on a particular day. 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday morning, while I'd taken Lorene to her follow-up at the orthopedic clinic. I asked whether he still had footage from that stretch of time. Gil set his mug down. Without a word, he stood up, crossed to the small desk in the corner of his living room, and came back with a laptop. He opened it, moved to a folder sorted by date, and turned the screen toward me. I keep 30 days, he said. I was going to bring it up to you, actually. Something didn't sit right with me, but I didn't want to stir things up if it turned out to be nothing. He clicked the file open. The footage was sharp. Gil had invested in a decent camera, clear angles, steady image, even with movement. The timestamp in the corner read 9:47 a.m. I recognized my driveway. I recognized the maple at the edge of the property, and I recognized the car that rolled up and stopped along the curb. Kevin's car. My son got out first, and even through the flat eye of a camera lens, I could read him. Relaxed, unhurried, the body language of a man doing something routine. Suzanne came around from the passenger side. Then Brody climbed out from the back seat. The three of them walked to my front door. I watched Kevin draw a key from his pocket, slide it into the lock without hesitation, without a glance over his shoulder, without any of the small tells a person shows when what they're doing feels uncertain. The door opened. They went inside. The timestamp jumped ahead. They were in my house for 47 minutes. My hands had gone cold somewhere around the moment I saw Kevin produce that key. By the time the footage showed them filing back out, I couldn't have told you what temperature it was in Gil's kitchen. Brody came through the door last. He was carrying something. Gil zoomed in when he caught my expression. A retractable tape measure, yellow-cased, still extended like he'd been using it right up to the moment he stepped outside. Your grandson had a tape measure. Gil said it quietly. Yes, I told him. He did. Brody clicked the tape measure shut and dropped it into his jacket pocket. Suzanne had her phone out, screen tilted toward herself, the body language of someone scrolling back through pictures they'd already captured. Kevin locked my front door on his way out. The same unhurried way a man locks up his own home before a Sunday errand. My eyes ached. Not tears, I wasn't there yet, but the sheer strain of holding my expression together while something deep inside me gave way along a crack that had been forming for a long time. Walter. Gil's tone was deliberate. You holding up? I'm getting there, I said. He gave a nod and moved to the next file. Got a second clip, he said. Different occasion. 2 weeks back. He almost deleted it, but he lifted his shoulders. Like I said. Something didn't sit right. The second clip was a Saturday afternoon, mid-September, 2 weeks back. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m. No family vehicle this time, just an unfamiliar dark blue sedan pulling into the spot where Kevin usually parked. The driver stepped out, a trim man in his 50s, blazer shirt collar open. He stood at the curb and took in the property with the deliberate patience of someone conducting an appraisal, working every angle, letting nothing go unread. Then he came up the front walk, pulled up just before the door, and pivoted to look back at the street. From that angle I could make out his face. A small notebook lay open in his left hand, and his pen was moving. He circled the front yard for about 10 minutes, scanning the roofline, dropping into a crouch, to poke at the foundation near the flower bed, marking things down without pausing. He finished by planting himself at the end of the driveway and photographing the house with his phone, one shot from dead center of the sidewalk that took in the entire front face of the building. Gil had caught a clean frame of the man's face. Recognize him? Gil asked. No, I said. I got a screenshot. Gil reached into the manila envelope next to the laptop and drew out a printed photo. He'd gone ahead and printed the thing, this precise, unhurried man, and pushed it across the table toward me. I lifted it, studied it, then held it flat against the table with two fingers, the way you hold something still when you haven't decided what comes next. Gil, I said, and there was a ragged quality to my voice I couldn't smooth out. I owe you for this. He waved it off. 3 winters you cleared my driveway while my back had me laid up, and not once did you bring it up. We're square. He shut the laptop. So what's your next move? I slipped the printed photo into my shirt pocket, pressed it against my chest. I'm going to figure out who he is, I said. After that, I'm picking up the phone and calling my attorney. Gil walked me out to the door. His hand came down on my shoulder for just a beat, the way men who grew up when we did say what they can't put into language. Then he let go. Anything more you need off that camera, he said, you say the word. I thanked and walked back across the street. My hand went to my shirt pocket as I moved, fingers resting over where the photo was. 47 minutes inside my house with a tape measure. A stranger with a notebook cataloging my roofline. Whatever Kevin had put into motion, it had traveled farther down the road than I'd grasped the day before. And the manila envelope sitting on my kitchen table, the thing that had cracked this open, was starting to feel like the top inch of something that ran a long way down. Kevin phoned Thursday morning and asked if he could stop by, said he wanted to sort this out the way grown people do. I told him to come. And I meant it not out of any change of heart, but because the only way to understand how far someone has gone is to let them stand in front of you, still believing they're ahead. 40 years in a warehouse had taught me that. The vendors who shorted the shipments, the reliable way to catch them was to keep accepting their deliveries. He showed up at 2:00 in the afternoon, jacket draped over one arm, tie hanging loose, carrying that easy, preloaded confidence he'd been building since his 20s. The look of a man who considers the outcome settled and is simply letting the clock run out. Dad. He gripped my hand at the door, solid and warm. Really glad you're open to talking. I think things went sideways Monday, and I'd like to get back on track. Come on in, I said. Lorene's in the back. We moved to the living room. Kevin took the armchair across from me and leaned forward, elbows dropped to his knees, a posture some sales coach had once told him read as engaged and trustworthy. He laid out a case about family-first approaches, about thoughtful planning, about how he and Suzanne had put real time into this and only wanted a good outcome for everybody. I listened. I gave him the nods at the right spots. Then Lorene's voice reached me from the recovery room. I apologized and headed down the hall. She was upright in the adjustable bed, right arm reaching toward the far corner, a tremor in it, not her condition, something else. A cold, fixed quality in her gaze that I hadn't seen since the afternoon she'd walked into Kevin's third-grade classroom and taken apart his teacher over a grading decision. Walt, she said, voice held low and level. Did you move my walker? I checked. It was across the room, angled into the far corner, not where I'd positioned it. Tuesday night, right alongside the nightstand, so her hand could find it before she was even fully upright. Somebody had shoved it 4 ft away. I brought it back and placed it exactly as it had been. Then I read the room the way I'd read a warehouse floor after a long weekend, corner-to-corner systematic cataloging what had shifted. The pencil marks showed up on the wall beside the window. 2 thin verticals and a horizontal light enough to miss if you'd never made marks like those yourself. I had made exactly that kind of mark. 10,000 times, maybe more. Somebody had come into this room, Lorene's room, the one I'd fitted out for her recovery, and measured it with a pencil and a tape. The photo album on the shelf had been disturbed as well. For 11 years it had lived on the left side, I knew, because Lorene's reading lamp anchored the right end, and the album evened out the shelf. Now it sat on the right, cocked slightly out of line, as though someone had lifted it, paged through it, and set it back without any thought for how it had been. My jaw locked up tight enough that I felt it between my shoulder blades. I went back up front. Kevin was thumbing through his phone, but it disappeared into his pocket the instant he saw me, and the look of attentive concern resettled itself on his face. Kevin, I said. Keeping the steadiness in my voice took more out of me than I'll say out loud. 3 weeks ago, when you came through this house, what were you doing in the back room? He didn't break. I'll give him credit for that. Whatever training had made him a salesman, it held. I'm not sure what you mean, Dad. We swung by to check on Mom. Nothing more than that. With a tape measure. Something crossed behind his eyes, a fast internal correction, the way a compass needle lurches and then locks. His jaw moved. We were just getting a feel for the layout, he said, voice gone deliberately flat, the tone of a man who's aware the game is up, but is counting on the other side not being able to prove it. Thinking ahead. Being responsible. That's what adults do. Being responsible. I let that phrase hang in the air between us. You took measurements in your mother's recovery room while I had her at a medical appointment. You shoved her walker to the other side of the room. You went through our albums. And that's your idea of being responsible. Kevin got to his feet. Something harder had come into his face, the easy manner dropping away like a coat he'd grown tired of wearing. Dad, you're seeing things that aren't there. We were trying to help. If you're going to turn every visit into a cross-examination, then maybe what this family really needs to discuss is whether the two of you are in any shape to keep handling a property like this on your own. Those words arrived like a palm struck flat against the side of my head. Not because they landed on truth, because I knew the maneuver. I'd watched it play out across 30 years of contract tables. When the facts won't hold up your argument, you go after the other person's judgment. Lorene appeared in the doorway. She'd gotten there on her own, one hand, skimming the hall wall the whole way, and the cost of it was visible in how tightly she held her mouth. But those eyes of hers were sharp as a plumb line. Kevin Ray Corbin, she said. And I will tell you, her voice did not waver once. You moved my walker 4 feet from my bed. I am recovering from spinal surgery. If I had gotten up in this night and reached for it, and it wasn't there, I could have fallen. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Kevin's mouth came open, then shut again. Mom, I didn't. Don't. Her voice snapped like a ruler across a desk. Don't tell me you didn't. Don't stand here and tell me what I know took place in my own home. I moved to Lorene's side and slipped my hand beneath her elbow, gently, just enough pressure to let her know I was beside her. Then I looked at my son. I think it's time for you to go, Kevin. He snatched his jacket off the arm of the chair. At the doorway, he stopped and turned back, and something in how he looked at me made my chest hurt. Right through all the anger, a flicker of something young and trapped and scared, gone almost before I could place it. And this isn't over, he said. No, I said. It isn't. And he was gone. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away from the curb. Lorene stood next to me with her hand folded into mine, and I could feel her pulse in her wrist running too fast. Not from the effort of walking down that hall, from everything that had happened inside this house. Walter, she said quietly. Call your attorney. I'd made that decision already. I just needed to hear her put it into words. I've known Stuart Quill since 1993. He drew up our wills the year Kevin entered high school, managed the title work when we refinanced in 2000, and once held me on the phone for 45 minutes, talking me down from a lawsuit over a property line argument with a neighbor 3 houses away. A dispute I would have lost badly expensively if he'd let me go through with it. Stuart is the kind of attorney who picks up his own phone, has your file committed to memory, and delivers hard news the way a good doctor does. Direct, clear, and without any relish in the telling. He picked up on the second ring. "Stuart," I said, "I need your help. And I think I needed it sooner than I'm calling." "Walter." His voice was unhurried, settled, the voice of a man with solid furniture in his office who has watched most of what people do to one another and stopped being surprised a long time ago. "Tell me what's going on." So I told him. Everything from the manila envelope Monday morning to the U-Haul reservation dated 8 weeks out to the copied key to the apartment on Kendall Avenue with the 28-in bathroom door to Gil's camera footage to the pencil marks on the wall of Lorene's recovery room. I talked for 18 minutes straight, and Stuart didn't cut in once, which has always been one of the things I've valued most about him. He waits until you've run dry before he starts working through it out loud. When I finished the line, held quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Walter," he said, "you were right to call me. But before we get into next steps, I need to ask you something important. Do you still have the trust documents, the ones we drafted in 1994 and amended in 2021? My heart gave a slow, deliberate thud. "They're in the fireproof box," I said. "Where they've been for 30 years. Gray fireproof lockbox, bottom shelf of the study closet." "Good." I heard Stuart let out a breath. Not quite relief, more the sound of a man who had come ready to carry a heavy thing and found it wasn't needed yet. "Walter, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to sit with it. Kevin is about to discover that he has been making plans around something that was never actually his to take." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Say that again." "A revocable living trust," Stuart said, his voice shifting into the measured, careful register he uses when something truly matters, "is a legal structure where you transfer ownership of an asset, your house in this case, into a trust that you yourself control. You and Lorene are what's called the trustees. That means all decisions about the property belong to you as long as you're both living. You can sell, renovate, refinance, anything an owner would do. Your day-to-day life doesn't change in any meaningful way." "I know all this, Stuart," I said. "We signed it. I know you do. I'm laying it out because what follows is the part Kevin has never reckoned with." A brief pause. "When we amended the trust in 2021, when you and Lorene came in quietly without a word to anyone, we rewrote the successor provisions. The language governing what becomes of the property once you're both gone. Kevin has always assumed he was the primary heir. He assumed that because no one ever told him any different. And because you and Lorene never pushed back on that assumption, he has spent years treating your house like an inheritance he was simply waiting to collect." My throat went tight. "The amendment changes that entirely," Stuart said. There was something in his tone, not satisfaction, but a kind of quiet solidity, the voice of a man who helped construct something durable and is relieved to find it still standing. "But Walter, what worries me more than the inheritance piece right now is what you've described happening this week. Your son let himself into your home with a key you never authorized. He and his family measured rooms and photographed the interior while you were out. Those are not ambiguous situations. What are they then? In Indiana," Stuart said, "entering someone's property without consent, even using a key the owner didn't sanction, can rise to criminal trespass. At minimum, it's civil trespass. The fact that he's your son doesn't alter the legal category. It just makes it more painful." I pressed the heel of my hand to my sternum. The ache there had been building since Monday, and I'd been writing it off as indigestion. "What do I need to do?" I asked. "First, hold off on changing the locks, not until I tell you the timing is clean. Because in these situations, sequencing matters." Second, I need you in my office tomorrow morning. Bring the trust documents if you can, but come regardless. I need to see you face to face. A pause. And Walter, there's something else I have to go over with you when you're here. Something I became aware of about 2 years ago. At the time, the bank had already rejected the application, and I couldn't confirm who had filed it. I didn't want to put a scare into you over something I couldn't yet stand behind. I sat on it too long. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. The way he said it sent my stomach dropping about 3 inches. What kind of something? I asked. Tomorrow, he said low and even. I'd rather put it in front of you in person. It's not the kind of thing to go over on the phone. After we hung up, I walked to the study. The closet held the smell of cedar and old paper, the particular quiet of a room that keeps things you rarely touch, but can't afford to misplace. I found the gray fireproof lockbox on the bottom shelf of the study closet, right where I'd set it in 1994. The same spot I'd checked twice a year every year since the way you test a smoke detector. Not because you expect fire, but because you understand the cost of being wrong. I carried it to the desk. I didn't lift the lid. I set both palms flat on the cool surface and stood in the stillness of that room, with the weight of 30 years pressing back against my hands. Kevin had been in this house with a tape measure. He had drawn up plans for these rooms, these walls, this life Lorene and I had assembled across 5 decades. What he had never thought to ask, what had never once seemed to occur to him, was what lived inside this box. Tomorrow morning, Stuart was going to show me something I wasn't sure I was prepared for. But tonight I had my hands on the one thing in this entire situation that couldn't leave my possession without my signature. And my signature wasn't going anywhere. Stuart's office carries the smell of old paper and real coffee. Not the kind that comes from a machine with pods, the kind brewed in a pot that's been going since 7 in the morning. Strong enough that you feel it before the first sip. I've walked into that office a dozen times across 30 years, and it has always smelled exactly the same. On a Friday morning, when everything beneath me felt like it was giving way, that sameness was more steadying than I had any right to expect. Stuart was already behind his desk when his assistant brought me in. He rose to shake my hand. He has done that every single visit, never once made me feel like anything less than a man worth getting up for, and waved me toward the chair across from him. "How's Lorene?" he asked, pouring a mug for me without waiting to be asked. "Stronger than she looks," I said, which has always been true. He gave a slow nod, and something passed through his expression, a brief, genuine warmth. Then he set down his own mug and reached for a folder sitting at the corner of the desk. Not the blue one I knew as our trust file. This one was red. "I want to begin with what I promised to show you last night," he said. "And Walter, I need you to prepare yourself, because what's in here is going to make you angry. Rightfully so. I want you to let yourself feel it and then put it to the side, because what counts is what we do next, not what it does to us in the moment." Before we get to what I discovered next and what it revealed about how far things had actually gone behind my back, let me ask you something. If someone you loved and trusted had quietly been working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait until every piece of proof was in your hands? I pressed both palms flat against my knees. "Show me." Stuart opened the red folder and pushed a document across the desk toward me. It was a mortgage refinance application. The property listed was 219 Sycamore Lane. The borrower's name was Walter Eugene Corbin. The date on the application was March 2020. I had never laid eyes on this document before in my life. "I didn't file this," I told him, and my voice came out quieter and more controlled than I actually felt, the way it does when something lands so far outside what you were prepared for that your mind needs a beat just to accept it's real. "No," Stuart said. "You didn't." He pointed to the signature line at the bottom. Someone had signed my name there, Walter E. Corbin, in handwriting that was close but off. The E shaped slightly differently from how I've formed it across 75 years of writing, the loop of the C on Corbin running a little too wide. The application was submitted to Keystone Federal Bank in March of 2020. Stewart said, his tone careful and level. The loan amount requested was $340 secured against your home. The disbursement account listed was not yours. He paused. The bank's fraud detection flagged the signature as inconsistent with your account records. A loan officer named Nadine Orford, and I want you to hold on to that name because she may well have saved your home, compared the signature on this application against the one on your original mortgage from 1986 and your refinance documents from 2000. They didn't match. I realized I'd been gripping my own kneecaps without knowing it. My knuckles had gone white. The application was denied, Stewart went on. The bank sent written notice to your home address. That letter never reached you. I only found out because Nadine Orford, following bank protocol, reached out to me as the attorney of record on your property. She'd turned up my name in the original title paperwork. She told me the whole story. She asked whether I intended to take it further. He folded his hands. I should have picked up the phone and called you right then. I talked myself into waiting, watching for a pattern, first getting more to stand on. That was the wrong decision. I'm sorry, Walter. I lifted the application in both hands and stared at my name. My name in someone else's handwriting on a document I'd never touched, requesting $340,000 against the house Lorene and I had spent 4 decades paying for. My eyes burned. Not grief. Something hotter than that. Something that rose in my chest and pushed outward into my arms, my jaw, the backs of my hands. In the United States, Stewart said, his voice gentle but exact, submitting a fraudulent signature on a mortgage application is bank fraud under federal law. It carries serious criminal penalties. I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm making sure you understand the full weight of what you're dealing with. I set the document down. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth the way the VA cardiologist had shown me after my blood pressure scare 3 years ago. I waited until my hands were steady before I said anything. Stewart, I said, tell me about the trust. He closed the red folder and opened the blue one. Our trust documents, the original 1994 version, and the amendment Lorene and I had signed in his office on a cold Tuesday in February 2021. Just the two of us, no one else told, no one else in the room. When you and Lorene came in and amended the trust 2 years ago, Stewart said you rewrote the successor provisions, the instructions for the property, once both of you are gone. Under the original 1994 terms, Kevin was the primary beneficiary. Under the 2021 amendment, he turned the page toward me and indicated a paragraph near the bottom of the second page. The property is to be sold following the death of both trustees and the proceeds placed into an educational fund for your great-grandchildren, administered by an independent trustee appointed by this office. Kevin receives nothing from the property. The room went very quiet. He doesn't know, I said. He has never been told, Stewart confirmed. He has assumed for 30 years that this house would eventually come to him. That assumption was never corrected. So he built his plans on top of it. Plans that, from what you've described this week, have been growing more aggressive. I thought about Kevin in my living room Monday morning, that easy, polished confidence. Leaning forward, hands clasped, speaking like a man presenting a conclusion everyone has already reached. He hadn't simply been arrogant. He'd been working from information he believed was solid. He thought the house was already his, I said. Yes. Stewart held my gaze. And now we're going to show him it never was. He walked me through the next steps. What to document, what to leave alone. how to time the lock change so it would hold up legally. We sat there for another 40 minutes. By the time I rose to leave, the red folder was locked in Stuart's cabinet. The trust documents were back in my possession, and something that had been rattling loose inside me all week had finally settled into place. I thanked him at the door. "Walter," he said, "one more thing. When I spoke with Nadine Orford at the bank, she mentioned that the denied application had been accessed twice afterward. Someone checked the status online using your account login credentials." My hand tightened on the doorframe. "Someone was watching to see if it went through," I said. That's what it looks like," Stuart said. "Drive carefully and call me the moment anything changes." I drove home with the trust documents on the passenger seat, and a very particular kind of fury settled in my chest. Not the hot, ragged sort that pushes words out of your mouth before you've thought them through. The cold kind. The kind that knows precisely what it intends to do, and is content to wait for the right moment. When I turned onto Sycamore Lane and pulled into the driveway, I could see Lorene through the front window. She was at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, an envelope lying flat in front of her. She wasn't reading. She wasn't looking out at the street. She was waiting with the particular stillness of a woman who has been carrying something on her own and has reached the point where she can no longer hold it alone. She looked up the moment I stepped through the door. Not startled she'd heard the car. She'd been listening for it. Lorene has always had that kind of attunement to me, the radar you develop for the person you've spent 52 years alongside. She can read the difference between the way I shut a car door on a good day and the way I shut it when the day went wrong. This time she'd already registered the controlled, careful click of a man holding himself together, and her eyes were working through my face before I'd even reached the hook for my keys. The envelope sat on the kitchen table between us like a third presence in the room. Letter-sized, plain white Kevin's handwriting on the front. Not Mom and Dad, just Mom written in the deliberate cursive he pulls out when he's after something. A paper-clipped set of documents peeked out from the top, where the flap hadn't been pressed all the way down. "Renee," I said, pulling the chair out across from her and lowering myself into it slowly. "What is that?" Her hands tightened around the mug. The knuckles paled against the ceramic, and she pressed her lips together the way she does when she has made up her mind to say something that's going to be hard to say. "He came in July," she said. "A Tuesday. You were at the VA clinic for your annual checkup. I had no idea he was coming, no call, no text. He just pulled up and knocked." My chest pulled tight. "Kevin came here alone in July. He sat right there." She tilted her head toward the chair next to her. "He was so gentle about it, Walter. That's the part I keep turning over. He was gentle and warm, and he called me Mom, and he told me he was worried about us. He said you'd been more forgetful lately." "I haven't been forgetful. I know that." Her voice frayed slightly at the edges. "I know that." But he said it so easily, like it was already settled, like I'd been the one who told him. And I felt myself nodding along, even though I didn't believe it, because that's what Kevin does. He builds agreement out of nothing. She slid the envelope across the table to me. "He said there were some documents that needed attention for protecting the house. He called it routine estate planning. Nothing dramatic, just tidying up some paperwork so everything would be in order if something happened to one of us." Her voice dropped half a register. "He put a pen in my hand, Walter. He actually put the pen in my hand." I opened the envelope with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Inside was a 2-page document, a deed transfer form filled out in advance. The property listed was 219 Sycamore Lane. The transferring party was Walter and Lorene Corbin. The receiving party was Kevin R. Corbin. There was a signature line at the bottom for each of us, and beside Lorene's line a small yellow sticky arrow aimed directly at the blank. Someone Kevin or Suzanne I'd never know which had pre-filled every field except the signatures. They had done the paperwork. All of it. Every line. The only thing missing was Lorene's hand on a pen. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. Not from tears, from the effort of keeping the rage contained inside my body where it belonged, rather than letting it loose in the kitchen where it would do nothing useful. "Did you sign?" The words barely made it out of me. Lorene shook her head, and the relief that moved through me was so physical, it felt like something structural had let go in my spine. "I asked him what I was actually signing," she said. "I told him I needed to understand it before my name went on anything. He got impatient, not shouting, but that tight-jawed, locked-down impatient. He has the kind he seems to think goes undetected." She sat a little straighter in her chair. And even through everything, a surge of pure love rose in me for this woman who had sat across from her own son with a pen in her grip and put it back down. "He said I was making it complicated. He said it was just paperwork. I told him I wanted to speak with you first." He left angry. I said back to her. He said she stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. He said, "Mom, I just need you to sign. It's not a big deal. You're making this harder than it needs to be." The pen in her hand. The pre-filled deed. "I just need you to sign." I pushed back my chair and walked to the window. The backyard sat there unchanged. The garden bed Lorene hadn't been able to tend this season. The dogwood tree I'd planted for her 40th birthday. The fence I'd replaced board by board 2 summers back, because I couldn't do the whole thing at once, but I could always manage one board at a time. 37 years of that yard, one thing at a time. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked it gently because I already knew why, and I needed her to feel that I understood, rather than hear that I was wounded by it. She made a sound that broke something open in me, not quite a cry, and not quite a laugh. Something suspended between them, the sound a person makes when they've been carrying a weight for 3 months and have finally been given permission to set it down. "Because of how you look right now," she said. "Walter, I could not watch you look at your son the way you're looking right now. Not back then. I wasn't ready to see it." I turned away from the window. She was crying now, quietly, tears moving down her face without drama or performance, the way Lorene cries when she doesn't want it to become about her. But the feeling has simply run past the point of holding. I crossed the room and gathered her carefully, the way you hold someone still in the middle of healing, one hand on her back, between her shoulder blades, the other resting against the side of her head. I held her while she cried into my shoulder. "You did exactly right," I told her quietly. "You asked your questions, you set the pen down, and you held your ground. You did exactly right. I should have told you sooner. You're telling me now?" She drew back and looked at me, eyes red, jaw steady. "What did Stuart say?" I looked at my wife, this woman who had been planting herself between me and pain for 52 years, sometimes without realizing she was doing it, sometimes knowing full well. And I thought about what was sitting in that red folder on Stuart's desk, and the loan application bearing a forged version of my name, and the trust document Kevin had never read and apparently never thought to ask about. I told her that everything is going to be all right. She held my eyes for a long moment, reading them for whatever she needed to find there. "Do you believe that?" she asked. I picked up the pre-filled deed from the table, looked at the blank signature lines, looked at the yellow, sticky arrow pointing at the place where Lorene's name was supposed to go. "What I believe," I said carefully, "is that Kevin made a very serious mistake, and I believe we're going to let him discover that on his own." That evening after dinner, the phone rang. It was our grandson Brody. And even though part of me didn't want to pick up, even though the last thing I had room for that night was another conversation that was going to cost me, I answered on the second ring. Because you always answer when it's family. Even now. Maybe especially now. I took the call out to the back porch. The evening had cooled the way September evenings do in Indiana, that particular in-between temperature, where a jacket isn't necessary, but you feel the air on your arms and the sky has gone that deep purple gray that says the day is genuinely finished. Lorene had gone to rest after dinner. I was sitting in the old wooden rocker I'd had since the mid-90s, the one with the loose armrest that shifts, if you lean back not doing much of anything, which was something I hadn't permitted myself in some time. My phone buzzed on the armrest, Brody's name on the screen. I sat with it for a moment. Then I picked up. Grandpa. His voice was wound tight, like a man who'd worked out his opening sentence in advance and lost it the moment the line connected. Hey. I wanted to call. I'm glad you did. I told him, and I meant it even then. How are the boys? They're good. They're good. A pause. Somewhere behind him I could hear a television low, the sound of a house settling into evening. Grandpa, I wanted to say I'm sorry. About Monday. The way things went. It was a lot. It was, I agreed. Another pause, a longer one. I let it sit. Brody had always been a boy who needed room to find his words. At 17, it was the same. Push him, and you'd get the wrong ones. Can I ask you something? I said. Yeah, sure. What did your father tell you about this house before Monday? What did he say to you? I heard Brody let out a slow, unsteady breath that told me the question had found a tender spot. He said you and Grandma had already worked it out, Brody told me. He said you were actually relieved, that the house had gotten to be too much for the two of you, and that you were glad to have a reason to downsize. A beat. He said it was basically settled. That Monday was just working out the details. My jaw went tight. Brody, your grandmother and I have never once agreed to leave this house. Not to your father, not to Suzanne, not to anyone. The silence that followed had a particular texture. The texture of a young man's understanding quietly restructuring itself into something he didn't want to recognize. Oh, Brody said. Just that one word. But everything was inside it. The specific sound of a 27-year-old realizing that the story he'd been given was a construction built to move him like a piece on a board. Brody. I kept my voice level, kept it warm, because this boy was not my enemy and had never been. I need to say this plainly. Nothing that happened Monday was your doing. You were handed something false and you acted on it in good faith. That belongs to your father, not to you. When he answered, his voice had gone rough. Grandpa, we were excited, you know, Amber was excited. The kids were already talking about the yard and God. He made a sound that was part groan, part something more broken underneath it. We were planning out their rooms. We had the whole thing laid out, and I never even thought to call you myself. I just went off what he told me. Because he's your father, I said. And a father's word is supposed to be the one you don't have to check. That one hit. I heard Brody draw in a breath like something had snagged in his chest. Can I ask you something now? He said, his voice quieter, more careful than before. How bad is it? I mean, is there any way back between you and Dad? I looked out at the backyard in the last of the September light. The dogwood tree Lorene loved. The garden bed she hadn't been able to get to this year. The fence I'd put up one board at a time. That's entirely up to your father, I said honestly. But Brody, there's something I need to ask you, and I want a straight answer. How much do you actually know about why you lost the rental? A long pause, longer than any of the others. We got behind, Brody said carefully. 4 months. The landlord filed. We moved out before it went any further. And your father knew about this. Yeah, Yeah, he knew. He said he'd help us work something out. Brody's voice shifted, then something moving through it, a note of comprehension settling in like a stone dropping through water, and it made my heart ache for him. He actually knew for a while, before we even told Amber's parents. He was the first person I called. I closed my eyes for just a moment. There it was. Kevin had known about Brody's housing trouble before the eviction was ever filed, and rather than helping his son find a way through it, rather than offering the deposit money I'd later put on the table or helping Brody work something out with the landlord or pointing him toward another rental, he had held on to that information. Kept it tucked away like a card he was saving for exactly the right hand. The right hand being the moment he needed a reason I couldn't refuse. My grandson's family losing their home hadn't been the cause of what unfolded Monday morning. It had been the lever. "Brody," I said, and I worked to keep my voice as steady and gentle as I could, with that quiet fury burning behind my ribs. "Your father didn't tell you about our house because he thought it would help you. He told you because your situation made it harder for me to say no. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The sound Brody made, then low-pained, the sound of something giving way quietly inside a chest that is doing its best to hold together, was one I won't set down for a long time. "Yeah," he said at last. "Yeah. I think I'm starting to." We talked a little longer. I told him the deposit offer was still there, that when he was ready to look for a place, I'd cover first, and last month, no conditions attached, nothing running back through Kevin. He said he needed to talk it over with Amber. I told him to take whatever time he needed. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone in my hand, while the September dark closed in around me. And I thought about what it costs a man to use his own grandson as a prop in a scheme he'd never own up to. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. 2 words and a link. I nearly didn't tap it, but something about the timing coming right on the heels of Brody's call, right on the heels of everything, made me go ahead. I found out later it was Gil. He'd set up a property alert for his own block years back, and my address had triggered it. He hadn't wanted to call. He figured I should see it first without his voice in my ear already telling me how to feel. I tapped the link. What loaded on my screen made my hand go cold so fast I nearly dropped the phone. The page came up slowly, the way pages do on a phone when your hands aren't entirely steady and you keep almost losing your grip. It was a real estate listing. Clean design, professional photographs. The kind of site a company invests in to look like something you can trust. The company name across the top read, "Swift Door Realty Fast Cash offers no hassle, close in 14 days. The property in the listing was my house. 219 Sycamore Lane. There was the maple tree out front that I'd had trimmed 3 summers ago. There was the porch with that slight sag on the left side I'd been meaning to get to. There was the front window, and through the curtain, Lorene's reading chair was visible as a soft shape in the light. My house photographed from the sidewalk, listed on a cash-buy real estate website I had never reached out to, never authorized, never heard of. The listed price was $204. I sat very still on that porch for a long moment, the phone screen glowing in the September dark. The market value of our home, I knew this, because Stuart had mentioned the figure when we updated the trust, was approximately $287,000. The gap between those two numbers was $46,000. That is not a rounding error. That is not an opening bid in a negotiation. That is the price you accept when you need something gone quickly, and the money isn't yours to begin with. I called Gil. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been awake, which told me he was the kind of man who stays awake when something's still unresolved, and I had always appreciated that about him. "Gil," I said, "I need you to look at something. I'm going to send you a number. Can you text back what you find?" "Send it," he said. I forwarded the link and sat there listening to the evening sounds. A dog somewhere down the street. A car moving along the main road 2 blocks over the particular quiet of a neighborhood settling into 9:10 at night. And I turned over in my mind what I was looking at. A cash-buy company. I'd seen the pitches for outfits like Swift Door on bus benches and late-night television. We buy houses as is any condition, fast, close, guaranteed. They go after people who need out in a hurry, divorces, foreclosures, estates. People who can't afford to wait out a traditional sale. They come in below market, and they close fast, and for someone in genuine trouble, that trade makes a certain kind of sense. But our house was not in trouble. We were not in trouble. We had not reached out to anyone about selling. Someone else had done that on our behalf, without our knowledge, without our consent. My phone buzzed. Gil. That company, Swift Door Realty, has an office on Meridian Street. The agent on the listing is Cliff Dunbar. Give me 2 minutes. I waited. The night air had gone properly cold, and I hadn't gone inside for a jacket because I couldn't bring myself to move yet. Couldn't make myself be inside that house with this sitting on my screen. Gil's next message came through with a photo attached. It was a LinkedIn screenshot. Cliff Dunbar, real estate professional, Swift Door Realty, specializing in quick-close residential acquisitions in the greater area. The profile picture showed a man in his 50s, trim dark blazer, open collar. The same man who had stood in front of my house 2 weeks ago with a notebook. I looked at that photo for a long moment. Then I called Gil back. That's him, I said the instant he answered. That's the man from your camera footage. The one with the notebook. I know, Gil said. And his voice had a tightness to it I hadn't heard from him before. Walter, I looked into Swift Door. They're a legitimate operation, but they move fast. The standard process is the seller contacts them. They dispatch an agent to assess the property. A cash offer comes within 72 hours, and the deal closes in 2 weeks. No open market listing, no realtor fees, no waiting around. Cliff Dunbar came to assess my property, I said. 2 weeks ago, Gil confirmed. Which means somebody contacted Swift Door 2 weeks ago and represented themselves as having the authority to sell your home. And either Cliff Dunbar didn't verify ownership properly, or he didn't care to, I said. A beat of quiet stretched between us. Then Gil said carefully, Walter, if they manage to close a sale before you can stop it, legally reversing it gets very complicated. Even with the trust in place, you'd be looking at a court fight. I was already dialing Stuart before Gil finished the sentence. I told him I was sorry to call on a Saturday morning, and he said, don't be. And I told him about the listing, about Cliff Dunbar, about the $241,000 asking price on a $287,000 house. The sound Stuart made was the sound of a man whose darkest professional suspicion had just been confirmed. Walter, he said. This changes the timeline. Whoever contacted Swift Door, and I think we both have a strong sense of who that was planning to push a sale through immediately after getting you and Lorene off the property. The 2-week moving timeline Kevin handed you on Monday wasn't chosen at random. It's the Swift Door closing window. My throat had gone dry. They weren't actually planning to move Brody in. I don't think Brody was ever the point. Stuart said, his voice measured and deliberate, the voice of a man who has learned to deliver terrible news without flinching. Brody was the reason you'd feel you couldn't say no. The actual plan was to get you and Lorene out of the house, push through a quick sale at a discount to clear Kevin's debts before anyone could react, and present the whole thing as a done deal, finished before you'd had a chance to talk to anyone. The yard in front of me went slightly out of focus. I blinked it back. What do I do? I asked. You come see me Monday morning, Stuart said. Between now and then, you don't sign a single thing. You don't let anyone through that door, and you don't let Kevin know what you know. Not yet. A pause. Walter, there's one more thing I need to share with you. I've been digging further into Kevin's finances. Some of what I turned up is going to sting, but you deserve the complete picture before Sunday. Give it to me Monday, I said. The words came out calmer than anything I was feeling inside. To everything. Monday. I ended the call and stayed put for a few more minutes outside in the chill phone gone dark, the house glowing behind me with Lorene in it, and 37 years of a life built inside those four walls. And somewhere on the other side of town, my son had put a $241,000 price tag on it and started a 2-week timer. Eventually, I went in. I turned the deadbolt and stood there in the entryway, palm pressed against the lock, taking in the weight and resistance of it. Still mine. For tonight, that would have to do. When I arrived at Stuart's office Monday morning, the manila envelope was already spread open across his desk before I'd pulled the chair out. Not the same one from Friday, this was new and fatter. The kind that requires a full weekend of phone calls and records requests to put together right. He'd put in the hours. I could see it in the tension across his shoulders, the way his eyes held that particular tightness a man gets after spending 2 days reading things that made his blood run hot for somebody else's sake. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please," I said. Strong. He filled the mug without a word and pushed it toward me, then settled back with the envelope across his lap and studied me for a moment, the way Stuart always does before he delivers something that's going to change the shape of things. Like he's letting you have one last breath of the world as it was. "Walter," he said, "everything you've taken in this past week is about to look different. I need you to sit with all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" "I've been counting inventory for 40 years, I said. "I know how to hold a number." The corner of his mouth moved almost a smile. He drew out the first page. "Kevin's finances," Stuart said, "have deteriorated far beyond anything a man his age and position should have permitted. Everything I'm about to walk you through is drawn from public court filings, civil records, and 2 judgment liens already entered at the county. None of this is confidential. It's the documented trail of decisions your son made across the past 4 years." He angled the top sheet toward me so I could read the case number. "The first obligation is $67,000, he said. It traces back to a cryptocurrency margin trading account Kevin opened in 2021. Trading on margin means he was using borrowed funds from the brokerage to multiply his positions. When it works, the gains are bigger. When it doesn't, the losses come out of his pocket plus interest. It didn't work. The account was closed out in March 2022, and the $67,000 deficit that remained was handed to a collections firm. They've since gone to court and won a civil judgment against him." I pressed my hands flat against my knees and kept them there. "The second figure," Stuart went on, moving to the next sheet, "is $54,000 spread across 3 separate personal loan agreements, all signed somewhere between 2020 and 2022. 2 of the creditors are private lending companies. The third is a credit union. Every one of them is in default. 2 have issued formal demand letters. The largest single loan, $31,000, carries a hard repayment deadline of November 30th of this year. November 30th, not quite 10 weeks out. The third," Stuart said, his voice as even as a forecaster reading off the damage from a storm that's already torn through, "comes to $62,000 in business credit card debt. The cards are in Kevin's name, but they run through his dealership sales account. Management there is aware. They're currently weighing whether to keep him on. I ran the numbers the way I'd always run numbers, fast, clean, no room for feeling. 67 and 54 and 62. $183,000. My son was carrying $183,000 in debt. The hardest deadline of the bunch was 8 weeks away. Stewart leaned in slightly. Walter, if your home sells at Swift Door Realty's figure of $241,000, once you subtract their commission and closing costs, you walk away with roughly $210,000. That retires all 3 debts and leaves something standing. The walls of the office seemed to press inward. I picked up the mug and drew a slow, deliberate sip just to occupy my hands with something. "Shy, Stewart," I said. "Tell me about Suzanne." He let out a breath through his nose. "Suzanne is, in my professional view, the one who designed the whole timetable. The crypto account was opened at her suggestion. I found a text exchange Kevin submitted as part of a dispute with the brokerage that references her recommendation. Once the account went under, she was the one who started pulling up your property's market value. The inquiry to Swift Door Realty came from an email tied to her event planning business. She told them she was a family representative with authority to discuss a possible sale. She told them she was authorized," I said. My voice came out hollow. "She had zero legal standing to do that." Stewart said no softness in it. "None. And Swift Door Realty's failure to confirm ownership before moving forward is their liability as much as hers. I sent them a cease and desist on your behalf this morning. The listing comes down before the day's out." Something in my chest gave just a fraction. Not exactly relief, more like the feeling of finding one firm foothold when you're still not sure about the ground beneath the other foot. "What does Kevin face?" I asked. "If the house stays off the market?" Stewart held my gaze. "Most likely bankruptcy. The damage to his credit would be severe. The primary creditor could seek wage garnishment, a court-mandated deduction straight from his paycheck until the balance is recovered. And he may well lose the dealership job on top of it. That," I said, "follows from what he chose to do." "It does," Stewart said quietly and without decoration. "Yes." I got to my feet and pulled my jacket off the chair back. The manila envelope lay between us on his desk. All those numbers, those filed judgments, all the ruin my son had quietly constructed and then pointed in my direction. "Stewart," I said, "I want to go ahead with everything we talked through Friday. The whole plan in whatever sequence you need." He rose and extended his hand. "Papers will be ready by Wednesday. And Walter, I'm aware this is your son. I understand what this takes out of you." "It takes what it takes," I said. "That doesn't make the right thing any different." On the drive home, I went a longer way than necessary, swinging out past the dealership on Meridian Street, where Kevin had put in 11 years. Plate glass front, a row of cars gleaming in the lot. The sales rankings posted just inside the door. His name was readable from the street, third down from the top. I thought about the point in a life when a person decides the shortest route to money runs through someone else. I thought about whatever moment had taught him that. Then I pointed the car home and let the thought go because certain questions only dead end and I had things waiting on me. I caught it the instant I stepped inside Tuesday morning. Something about the wall above the fireplace was off. My brain needed a full 3 seconds to catch up to what my eyes already sensed, the particular wrongness of an empty space where something solid had always been. I was standing in the center of my own living room, coat, still buttoned, keys in my fist, staring at the stretch of wall above the mantel where a frame had held its place for 31 years. The nail was still there. The faint ghost of a shadow on the paint. The outline the frame had preserved while everything around it slowly dimmed was still there. The small loop of picture wire still hung from the nail, but the photograph itself was gone. Our wedding portrait. June 1972. The steps of St. Anthony's Church. The oak frame Lorene had picked out herself from a little shop on 5th Street the week before our first anniversary. In it, she is laughing at something outside the camera's frame just off to the left. I've never known what it was, and I've never once asked, because not knowing has always been part of what I love about that picture. And in it, I'm not looking at the lens at all, I'm looking at her. Because even back then, I knew exactly which thing in the frame was worth watching. 31 years on that wall, gone. A tightness moved through my chest that had nothing to do with anything medical and everything to do with something raw and older, something that lives closer to grief than anger. I went through the living room behind the couch across the bookshelf along the side table. I looked in the hallway. I finally found it in the storage closet off the kitchen, standing against the far wall behind the Christmas boxes, its face pressed toward the back, hidden unless you already knew to go looking. Someone had taken our wedding portrait and hidden it in a closet with its face to the wall. I called Kevin. He answered on the 4th ring, which told me he'd seen my name come up and used that moment to collect himself. Dad. His tone was measured, professionally easy. What's going on? There's a photograph gone from above the fireplace, I said. Our wedding photo. Do you know anything about that? A pause shorter than the ones from the week before. He was getting faster at managing them. Suzanne may have moved it when she stopped by. She said something about the room feeling a little dated. She was only trying to help. The anger that swept through me was swift and surgical, almost like clear-headedness. Suzanne was in my home, I said, handling my belongings, without a word to me, without my consent. She took our wedding photograph and put it in a closet. Dad, Kevin. My voice dropped to a register I'd used no more than twice in all his growing up years. The register that meant pleasantries were done. I need you to hear me. This past week I have been learning in detail exactly what you and Suzanne have been arranging. The moving truck booked 8 weeks ago. The key your wife had copied. The apartment on 527 Kendall Avenue with the broken elevator. The tape measure your son brought into this house. The real estate company your wife contacted to sell my property without so much as asking me. The mortgage application filed in my name in 2020 bearing a signature that wasn't mine. The line went so quiet all I could make out was his breathing. I don't know what you think I'm not finished. I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose and kept on. There is an attorney who has been assembling a file since Friday. There is camera footage of your family entering this property without permission. There is documentation of a forged signature on a federal loan application. And there is a trust document you have never read and never thought to ask about. And it is going to answer every question you imagine you have about this house. Dad. His voice was different now. The professional warmth gone, something harder and more desperate filling the space beneath it. You're turning this into something it's not. You're getting confused. You've always had a hard time seeing the full picture when it comes to family. Don't. The word came out the way a door shuts. Don't you dare suggest I'm confused. I ran a warehouse inventory for 40 years without dropping a single case count. I know precisely what I have, Kevin, and I know precisely what you tried to take. Fine. His voice turned cold and flat, and I heard something underneath it I hadn't heard before. A recklessness, the particular sound of a man with no more ground left to defend. Fine, Dad. If that's how you want to play it, go ahead and let the whole family know you'd rather grip a house deed than help your own grandson. I'll make certain Aunt Rosemary hears how you turned your back on Brody's children. I'll make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of man picks paperwork over people. My grip on the phone tightened until I felt it up into my shoulder. Make sure they do, I said quietly. And make sure they also ask why you needed to sell my home to a cash buyer at $46,000 under market. Make sure they ask about the judgment liens. Make sure they ask Suzanne about the email she sent to Swift Door Realty from her business account. A long silence. Then, in a voice that had shed every hard edge and sounded suddenly terribly young. Who do you know about that? Because I pay attention, Kevin. I always have. You simply stopped believing I did. I ended the call. Set the phone face down on the kitchen table. Stood at the counter with both palms pressed into the cool surface, and breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth, counting each breath the way my cardiologist had shown me until the trembling in my hands finally quit. Lorene appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard my voice, not the words, only the tone, and she had come. She had her walker today and was moving carefully, but her eyes were steady and sharp and fixed entirely on me. "Was that Kevin?" she asked. "Yes." "What did he say?" I looked at my wife, at the woman who had set down her pen back in July when everything in her wanted to believe her son. At the woman who had walked a hallway without her walker to face him in our living room. At the woman whose photograph was propped against a wall in my storage closet with its face turned away. I went and retrieved the photo. I carried it back to the living room and rehung it in its rightful place. I straightened the frame until the level was true and stepped back. Lorene stood beside me, her hand finding mine. "Walter." Her voice was quiet and certain. "It's time." I squeezed her hand, walked to my desk, took out a yellow legal pad and a pen with ink left in it, and began writing a list. By the time I turned in Tuesday night, the pad held 7 items. I'd written them in pencil, not pen, the same way I used to draft inventory tallies before entering them into the system. Pencil means you're still thinking. I wanted every step verified in my own mind before anything became final. 7 items, each one numbered, each one depending on the one before it, arranged in the sequence that law and plain sense required. Wednesday morning, I started with step 1. The locksmith arrived at 8:45. A young man from Hendricks and Son named Daryl, who carried the quiet efficiency of someone who has rekeyed a great many locks for a great many people, and could tell without being told that this was not ordinary work. I walked him through the house front door, back door, garage entry. 3 new deadbolts, solid brass, the kind that give you a definitive click when you throw them. Daryl also mounted the video doorbell with the intercom I'd ordered online Monday night, the model that lets you see who's standing outside and talk to them straight from your phone without cracking the door. "Want me to walk you through the app?" Daryl asked when he'd finished, screwdriver still in hand. "Please," I said. And he took me through it on my phone, step by step, with the easy patience of a young man who explains technology without making you feel the gap in years. After Daryl left, I stood in the entryway with the new keys in my hand, 3 of them bright and stiff, the old copies dead as of 9:52. Wednesday morning. I held them a moment longer than I needed to. 40 years in inventory had hammered one truth into me, above the rest: control what you can count. These keys I could count. 3. Lorene's and mine. No one else's. Step 2 came Wednesday afternoon. I contacted a home care agency on the east side, one the VA had suggested 2 years earlier, when Lorene first began having trouble with her back, and arranged for a part-time caregiver named Connie to start the following morning. Connie was 58, certified with solid experience in post-surgical recovery, and available 3 mornings a week. I told the agency I needed someone dependable and discreet. They sent Connie. She arrived Thursday at 8:00, shook my hand at the door, and introduced herself to Lorene with the warm directness of a woman who has spent decades putting frightened people at ease. Within 20 minutes, she and Lorene were talking through physical therapy routines as though they'd crossed paths before. I watched from the doorway and felt something unclench in my chest that had been knotted for longer than I cared to measure. Lorene had someone. Whatever Sunday brought Lorene had a person whose sole purpose was her. Step 3 was Thursday morning. I drove Lorene to Dr. Aldridge, our family physician for 19 years, a quiet and exacting man with the uncommon ability to hear what his patients are actually asking for, even when they're asking for something else. I told him what had been happening. I told him I needed written confirmation that both Walter and Lorene Corbin were of sound mind and fully capable of directing their own financial and legal affairs. Dr. Aldridge looked at me over the top of his glasses for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have it ready before you leave," and stood to begin the evaluation. He didn't ask why. He'd practiced long enough to understand. The letter ran 2 paragraphs clear, clinical, signed and dated. I folded it into the manila envelope I was assembling. Step 4 was Thursday afternoon, the envelope itself. I laid everything out on the kitchen table in the sequence Stuart had specified. The deed to 219 Sycamore Lane, the mortgage statement showing Walter and Lorene Corbin as sole obligors, a summary page from the trust document, 2 paragraphs plain language, Dr. Aldridge's letter. Gill's footage on a USB drive, the screenshot of the Swift Door Realty listing, Stuart's cease and desist confirmation, and a copy of the police non-emergency line request I'd filed Wednesday, asking for a civil standby presence at my address Sunday morning at 9 Su. I gathered everything into the manila envelope and set it on the entryway table next to the new deadbolt. Step 5 was Friday, Stuart's office, 40 minutes mapping out the Sunday plan. Stuart would arrive at 219 Sycamore Lane at 9:15 with a notary and the complete trust documents. 2 officers from the county's Elder Protection Unit had confirmed the civil standby. Everything accounted for. Everything on paper. Walking out of Stuart's office that Friday afternoon, I paused at the top of the steps and took a breath of October air. The street trees had gone full autumn reds and golds that had no business being that beautiful given what was bearing down on my life. I found myself thinking about 40 years of yielding, of accommodating, of stepping aside. Every time Kevin had pushed and I had given ground. Every loan request I'd turned over in my mind. Every visit where I'd swallowed words that deserved to be spoken because I told myself the peace wasn't worth disturbing. I thought about how a man who keeps moving out of the way eventually teaches everyone around him that the way is always clear. I wasn't angry at myself over it. There was no time for that, and it wouldn't have done any good. I noted it the way I would log a recurring discrepancy in the inventory counts, not to assign blame, but to make sure the system ran differently from here on out. Saturday passed without incident. Lorene and I ate dinner early. Connie had gone home. The house was ours alone, just the 2 of us, the way it had always been before any of this got started. Then at 9:15 Saturday night, my phone buzzed. "Kevin, we'll be there at 9:00 tomorrow, bringing the whole family. Fresh start, Dad. Please be reasonable." I read it once, put the phone face down on the nightstand. And then I did something I hadn't managed in 3 weeks. I slept. Deeply, fully, the sleep of a man who has worked through every item on his list and knows exactly where things stand. Some kinds of preparation put you on edge. This kind made me ready. I got Lorene her breakfast at 7:00. Scrambled eggs with toast the way she's taken it since long before we met, and 2 cups of coffee with cream. We sat at the kitchen table the way we've sat at kitchen tables across 52 years of mornings. Her side, my side, the window between us, admitting whatever light the day had to offer. That Sunday it came in gray and gentle, the particular stillness of an October morning, when the world seems to be holding its breath. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left that needed saying. Most of it had already passed between us across decades at this exact table. What remained now was the quiet ease of two people who have weathered enough together that they don't need to explain every moment out loud. At 8 Odrin, I checked the intercom. At 8:15 I called Stuart, who confirmed he was leaving his house in 40 minutes. At 8:30 I stood in the living room wearing my good shirt, the charcoal gray one Lorene had given me for our 48th anniversary, and looked at the room. The wedding photo sat above the fireplace where it belonged. The manila envelope rested on the entryway table beside the new deadbolt. The camera above the door was live, its feed open on my phone. Everything in place. Everything counted. Lorene came out of the back room in her good cardigan, the burgundy one she saves for occasions, and settled herself into the armchair by the front window. Her walker stood close by, but she sat up straight, chin level, with the bearing of a woman who has decided exactly how she means to present herself today. "How do I look?" she asked. "Like someone who owns this house," I said. She smiled at that, a real one, warm and carrying a little heat at the edges. At 8:51 I heard the engine before anything came into view. A heavy diesel rumble swinging onto Sycamore Lane, the kind that travels on a quiet Sunday morning, the way church bells do. I moved to the front window and watched. The U-Haul needed 2 passes to park a large truck the size you rent when you're clearing out an entire household, and whoever was behind the wheel misjudged the curb twice before settling it in. That detail stuck with me the way small details do when everything else is moving fast. They had rented a truck big enough for everything we owned. They had come intending to empty my house completely. Kevin's car pulled in after it. Then Suzanne's SUV. Then a sedan I recognized as belonging to Aunt Rosemary, Kevin's aunt, on his mother's side. A woman in her mid-70s who had always treated family loyalty as a competition she intended to win. They climbed out of their vehicles the way a rehearsed effort looks. Kevin first, then Suzanne, then the rest of them, moving with the quiet confidence of people who believe the difficult part is already behind them. I watched them organize themselves on my property through the camera feed on my phone, and I felt something that caught me off guard with its evenness. Not fear, not fury, something closer to the feeling I used to get at the end of a long inventory tally, when the final numbers came clean. A still, complete kind of clarity. Across the street, Gil's screen door creaked. He came out carrying his coffee mug and settled into his porch chair with a direct line of sight to my driveway. His face held the careful neutrality of a man who is paying close attention and making no effort to hide it. He caught my eye through the camera and gave the smallest nod. Nobody knocked first. That is the detail I will carry with me longest. Kevin went straight to the back of the U-Haul and dropped the loading ramp. The metal rang against the pavement and the sound carried off every house on the block. Brody and Amber began pulling moving blankets from the truck bed. And then Suzanne and I, want you to understand what this reveals about who she is, walked straight up onto my porch and pushed my screen door open with her foot. Not her hand, her foot. And wedged it open with a cardboard box she pulled from under her arm. My screen door, held open by their box, on their timetable. Before they had knocked a single time. Only then did Kevin take out his phone and call me. I watched it happen through the camera, him raising the phone to his ear, his expression carrying that particular blend of confidence and calculation I had been reading for 48 years. My phone buzzed on the entryway table. His name on the screen. I let it ring 4 times. Then I picked up. Kevin. My voice came out level, unhurried. Dad. His tone was warm, deliberately warm, the warmth of a man who has decided that the right inflection can still turn everything around. Look out your window, everyone's here. It's time to get this done, okay? Come open the door and we'll work through the rest of it together. That's all you need to do. Through the camera, I watched him standing on my front walk phone pressed to his ear, the truck hulking behind him, the family arranged around him like a stage he'd spent weeks building. I watched Aunt Rosemary edge closer to the door. I watched Suzanne position herself beside the screen, one hand resting on the frame, as though she were already deciding where to put the furniture. I watched Brody standing at the foot of the ramp with a moving blanket folded in his arms, and the look of someone who desperately wished he were somewhere else. From the armchair, Lorene's voice came quiet and absolutely certain. "Walter, it's time." I picked up the phone and crossed to the intercom panel and put my thumb on the button. The speaker crackled. Through the camera, I watched the sound stop everyone mid-motion. Suzanne's hand went still on the screen doorframe. Aunt Rosemary's chin lifted. The two kids looked up from the grass. Even Kevin, standing at the base of the porch steps with his phone still raised, went completely motionless. I pressed the button and spoke. "Kevin." My voice came through the outdoor speaker, steady and without hurry. Through the camera, I watched him flinch, small, quickly suppressed the flinch of a man who had expected something softer. "You said there's a piece of paper that decides who this house belongs to." "You're right. There is." Kevin's face opened into the start of a smile, the relieved, almost triumphant smile of a man who believes he's about to hear what he traveled here for. "Good. So your name is not on it." The smile vanished like a switch had been thrown. Suzanne's hand fell from the doorframe. Aunt Rosemary's arms drew tight across her chest. Brody set the moving blanket down on the truck ramp with great deliberateness, like a man suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. Kevin stepped up onto the porch, jaw set, eyes hard. "Dad, stop playing games and open this door. Tuck, that truck runs at an hourly rate, and every person out here is watching you humiliate yourself." "Stuart Quill is coming around the corner onto Sycamore Lane," I said through the speaker. "I'd hold right there if I were you." Stuart's dark sedan rolled into view at the far end of the block, unhurried. Deliberate, the arrival of a man who had timed it exactly. A second vehicle followed close behind, and behind that a county cruiser. No lights. Two officers visible through the windshield. Kevin's eyes went to the cruiser, and something drained out of his face, the particular color change of a man watching his certainty curdle. "Oh, what is this?" The words came out half a register higher than he intended. "You sicked the police on your own family. This is between us." "Kevin." Stuart's voice, level and carrying, came from the front walk. "Let me do the talking." He came up the path alongside Bet Quill, the notary from his firm. I cracked the door wide enough for both of them to enter, shut it, locked it, and waited 2 minutes. Then I opened it all the way and walked out onto my own porch with Lorene at my side. Her walker in front of her, the burgundy cardigan vivid against the pale morning sky. Her posture so upright, she could have been standing in a courtroom herself. Stuart to my right. The two officers settled at the foot of the steps, not menacing, just planted the way an official presence anchors a situation without a word. Stuart read in his courtroom register. "The property at 219 Sycamore Lane is held in the Corbin Family Revocable Living Trust, established 1994, amended February 2021. Walter and Lorene Corbin retain lifetime rights of occupancy and serve as full trustees. Upon the passing of both trustees, the property is to be sold and all proceeds directed into an educational fund for their great-grandchildren. Kevin Ray Corbin holds no ownership share, no right of inheritance, and no legal authority to occupy, transfer, or place any encumbrance on this property." Suzanne threw herself forward and ripped the document out of Stuart's grip. Her hands shook badly enough that the pages made noise. She went through it line by line, hunting for her name, for any crack she could get purchase on. There was nothing there. That can't be enforceable. Her voice was ragged now, every bit of the careful warmth she'd walked up wearing completely gone. You don't just cut off your own child. That is your blood. The kind, Stuart said at exactly the same volume as before, who already owns a home. Aunt Rosemary pushed to the front. Walter, you are burning your family to the ground over a document. Ma'am? The female officer spoke from the steps unhurried. There is no dispute about who holds title here. Anyone who isn't the property owner, please clear back to the sidewalk. Kevin hadn't taken a step. He was standing squarely on my front walkway with every layer of himself peeled back, the poise, the assurance, the practiced ease of 48 years of knowing how to hold a room. What it left behind was something rawer, younger, afraid. His voice, when it came, had come loose at the seams. Dad, I owe more than I can handle. The biggest creditor moves in 2 weeks. I ran out of options. Tears on his face, and seeing my son cry still opened something in my chest that nothing else touches. All I wanted was the house, just to get out from under it. I let the silence hold for a moment. The boy I steadied on his first bicycle in this driveway, the man who pressed a pen into his convalescing mother's hand and dressed it up as routine paperwork. You had choices, Kevin, I said, quietly but clearly. You walked yourself down this road over years, so you'll just stand there while I drown. I'll stand here while you answer for what you built. Those aren't remotely the same. Brody began reloading the moving boxes into the truck by himself, without anyone directing him to. The measured, quiet effort of a young man working through something that wasn't entirely his doing, but that he'd accepted, was now sitting on his shoulders. Suzanne guided Kevin firmly toward his car. Her face, past fury, now settled into something colder and more deliberate. Aunt Rosemary passed me on the porch without a syllable. I gave her a nod. She kept walking. When Brody got to his car, I came down off the porch. Brody? He stopped and turned the rims of his eyes red. My offer hasn't changed. 2 months deposit paid straight to you. Nothing going through your father. Reach out when you're ready to put your own signature on your own place. Something moved across his face like light through a curtain that's been shut a long time. One slow nod. Then he was in the car and gone. One by one the vehicles pulled away, until Sycamore Lane fell quiet around me. I went inside, threw the deadbolt and stood in the hallway. Hand on the lock. Eyes shut. 3 full seconds. Then I walked to the living room and nudged the wedding photo a 1/4 inch left. The morning's commotion had unsettled it slightly, and stepped back to look. Lorene appeared beside me. Her hand came into mine. Is it finished? She asked, her voice barely above a murmur. It's finished, Renee, I said. She brought her head to rest against my shoulder and breathed out long and slow and finally without strain. 6 weeks is enough for the debris to clear and for the real shape of things to emerge. By December, the trees lining Sycamore Lane were stripped down to bare branches, every trace of October gone. Indiana winters have a quality all their own, gray, motionless, and frank. The air doesn't dress anything up, but it doesn't cover anything up either. Most mornings, I came downstairs and found Lorene at the kitchen table working through her physical therapy on her own, steadier session by session than she'd managed in a long while. Watching her push through that without complaint, without needing credit for it, hit me somewhere I couldn't put language to. Connie came Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She and Lorene had built up the comfortable private shorthand of 2 people who've quietly decided they're fond of each other. Shared opinions on the physical therapy regimen, references to things I'd missed. I was thankful in ways that outran anything I could have said. Brody phoned 10 days after Sunday. Calmer, the voice of someone who'd turned things over and landed somewhere more solid. He'd located a 2-bedroom near the boys' school. Amber approved. He asked if the offer was still good. It is, I told him. The deposit went out that same afternoon, 2 months directly to Brody, with Kevin nowhere in the transaction. 20 minutes later, a text. "Thank you, Grandpa. I mean it." I read it 2 times. Then I walked out to have a look at the dogwood tree I'd planted for her 40th birthday. It was perfectly fine. But I needed somewhere to put what I was feeling. Kevin filed for bankruptcy in October. Aunt Rosemary was the one who told me she called once in November. Not to revisit Sunday. Not to relitigate any of it. Just the measured voice of a woman reckoning honestly with what she'd participated in. The dealership had terminated him over how he'd run the business accounts. I knew the particulars better than she did, but kept that to myself. She said the boys were finding their footing. I told her I was relieved to hear it. I was. A late November evening. Lorene and I at the kitchen table after the dishes were done. The dark outside the window doing what December dark does, making the kitchen light seem warmer than anything in the world has any right to be. She looked across at me and asked the thing I'd known was coming. "Walter," she said just above a whisper, "do you still love him?" I sat with Kevin in my mind, the child learning to balance a bike. The grown man with the U-Haul parked at my curb. The face on the front walk with tears cutting down it, grieving not what he'd done, but what he'd lost. "He's my son," I said. Lorene's head moved a slow, gentle correction. "That isn't what I asked." "Yes," I said. "I do." But love was never a reason to put a weapon in his hand and point it at you. It never was, Renee. She nodded, not quickly, not lightly. The nod of a woman who had needed it said out loud, even though she'd already known it. I got up and went to the living room. The wedding photo in its place above the fireplace, exactly where it had hung for 31 years. Lorene with her laugh aimed at something beyond the camera's left edge. Me with my eyes on her instead of the lens, because even then I already knew what was worth looking at. I took the trust document summary from my shirt pocket and slipped it behind the glass just beneath the photo. Hidden unless you knew to reach for it. But there, real, not going anywhere. Kevin had been after the paper. He had never once grasped what the house was. Lorene called from the kitchen. She needed the ceramic creamer on the top shelf, the one with the small chip on the lid we never fixed, kept for 31 years. I brought it to her. She glanced up with a smile, warm, self-contained, entirely her own. "Come sit down, Walter," she said. "Your tea's gone cold." I sat. The house settled around us the way it always had, no performance in it, just the solidity of something built to hold. If you have given your life to making space for people who read your patience as permission, let me speak to you from a kitchen table in December. Your name is already on the deed to your own life. Nobody has to grant you the right to act accordingly. Some have called this revenge. A justice story. A father who finally stopped moving aside. That may be the view from the outside. But from this kitchen in December, I don't sit here feeling like a man who came out ahead. I feel like a man who finally stopped hemorrhaging something he had no business losing to begin with. Here is what I wish somebody had said to me 40 years back, and what I'm saying to you now, so you don't have to earn this lesson the hard way. Don't wait. Don't keep clearing space for people who have never once cleared space for you. Don't mistake being needed for being loved. I made that error for decades on end, and it nearly stripped Lorene of the roof above her head and the grab bars bolted to her bathroom wall. I believe God puts every person's name on something, a life, a home, a purpose, and it is not humility to stand there while someone else crosses it out. It is simply loss. If there is family justice anywhere in my story, It isn't in the trust document or the locked door or the look on Kevin's face when Stuart finished reading. It's in Lorene sitting across from me at this table, both hands wrapped around her tea in her own home. That is the only justice that ever mattered, my personal opinion. A parent's love is not a blank check. You can love your child with everything you have and still refuse to bankroll their worst instincts. Those two things are not in conflict. That's where I'll leave Walter's story, not with a verdict, but with a quiet kitchen table and two people who still have each other. This didn't come cheap. It cost years of second-guessing a drawer full of doubts I never voiced, and very nearly the home Lorene and I built our life inside. What it taught me is that love without boundaries isn't love. It's an open door that the wrong people will walk through every time. I believe God put that house under our names for a reason, and no amount of family pressure was ever going to change what was right. The hard part was finally believing that myself. So here's what I want you to take from Walter's story. From this whole long account of family justice and what it takes to hold on to what is yours. Document everything. A memory fades. A signed paper does not. If someone keeps asking you to decide quickly, that urgency is the warning. Slow down. Loving your child does not mean absorbing their consequences. You can hold them in your heart and still say no. And do not wait until a crisis forces your hand. The conversation you keep putting off is exactly the one that matters most. These father stories don't always end with a clean resolution. But this one did, and it did, because Walter stopped waiting for permission to protect his own life. If today's story stirred something in you, leave a thought in the comments. I read everyone. Share it with someone who might need to hear it right now. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Alpha Dad Stories so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.